In 2007, Nokia held 49% of the global mobile phone market. Nearly half of all phones sold worldwide carried the Nokia brand. This was not a recent achievement. Nokia had dominated mobile telephony for more than a decade. The company had survived the transition from analog to digital networks. It had navigated the shift from business devices to consumer products. It had outcompeted Motorola, Ericsson, and dozens of other manufacturers. Nokia was not just selling phones. It was operating a global manufacturing system, a supply chain that spanned continents, a research apparatus that filed thousands of patents annually, and a distribution network that reached nearly every market on Earth. The company employed over 100,000 people. It maintained manufacturing facilities in 10 countries. Its products were sold in more than 150 markets. Revenue exceeded 50 billion euros. This was a functioning industrial system. Not a startup, not an experiment, but an established organization with proven processes, accumulated expertise, and institutional knowledge built over decades. 6 years later, Nokia's mobile phone business was sold to Microsoft for a fraction of its former value. The market position had collapsed. The brand had lost relevance. The system that had worked for years had failed to adapt. Nokia's success was built on manufacturing excellence and distribution scale. The company understood that mobile phones were manufactured products, not software platforms. Success required optimization of supply chains, quality control, cost management, and logistics. Nokia excelled at these operations. Manufacturing efficiency created price advantages. Nokia could produce phones at lower cost than competitors, while maintaining quality. This allowed aggressive pricing in emerging markets while preserving margins in developed ones. Distribution partnerships were comprehensive. Nokia worked with hundreds of carriers worldwide. Each carrier relationship required negotiation, technical integration, and ongoing support. Nokia had the organizational capacity to manage this complexity at scale. Product development followed a matrix structure. Hardware engineers, software developers, designers, and regional market specialists worked in parallel. Each group had input on product decisions. This structure prevented any single department from dominating the process. The Symbian operating system provided technical foundation. It was optimized for the hardware constraints of early mobile phones, limited memory, slow processors, small batteries. Symbian was efficient in ways that alternative systems were not. Cultural factors reinforced these strengths. Nokia's Finnish roots emphasized consensus decision-making, long-term planning, and stability. Management promoted from within. Career paths were long, institutional. Knowledge was preserved. Quality control was rigorous. Products were tested extensively before release. Reliability became a brand attribute. Nokia phones were known for durability, battery life, and consistent performance. This combination, manufacturing efficiency, distribution scale, matrix organization, and stability-oriented culture, created a self-reinforcing system. Each element supported the others. The whole was optimized for incremental improvement of existing products. The system was built on an assumption that was never questioned because it had always been true: that mobile phones were primarily communication devices refined through hardware innovation. Product development cycles assumed that each generation would improve on the previous generation through better screens, longer battery life, smaller form factors, and additional features like cameras or music players. Software was supporting infrastructure, not the primary value proposition. Decision-making processes assumed time was available. Consensus required months of internal discussion, market research, technical validation, and alignment across departments. This was not considered slow. It was considered thorough. The organization assumed that carrier relationships were permanent assets. Carriers controlled distribution, decided which phones to promote, and influenced consumer choice through subsidies and shelf space. Maintaining these relationships was strategic priority. Manufacturing investments assumed that hardware complexity was the competitive barrier. The more difficult a phone was to manufacture, the harder it would be for competitors to replicate. Capital investment in production. Capacity was considered defensive moat. Research priorities assumed incremental advancement. Nokia's research labs worked on improving existing technologies, better antennas, more efficient batteries, improved camera sensors. Fundamental architectural changes were not the focus. Market segmentation assumed that different products served different customers. Nokia maintained dozens of product lines, each targeting specific price points and regional preferences. This portfolio approach assumed that breadth of offering was strength. The entire structure was optimized for a world where phones evolved gradually, where hardware determined differentiation, where carriers controlled access, and where manufacturing scale created competitive advantage. None of these assumptions were wrong when the system was designed. They had all been validated by years of success. The iPhone launched in 2007. It was not the first smartphone. Nokia had been making smartphones for years. Symbian powered millions of devices globally. But the iPhone represented a different architectural approach. The device was designed as a software platform that happened to have phone capabilities, rather than a phone that happened to run software. The touchscreen interface eliminated the physical keyboard that had been considered essential. The App Store model allowed third-party developers to extend functionality. The device was positioned as a computing platform, not a communication tool. Nokia's initial assessment was measured. The iPhone was expensive. It lacked features that Nokia phones had: removable battery, memory card slot, physical keyboard. Its battery life was shorter. The touchscreen seemed impractical for typing. Internal analysis noted that the iPhone would appeal to a specific segment: affluent consumers who valued design over functionality. But it would not displace Nokia's position in mainstream markets or emerging economies where price sensitivity dominated. This assessment was not unreasonable given available information. The iPhone's initial sales were modest. Compared to Nokia's volume, carriers still controlled most distribution. Manufacturing costs suggested the iPhone model could not scale to Nokia's price points. But the decision cycle to respond was slow. Consensus-based governance meant that response required agreement across multiple departments: hardware teams, software teams, regional divisions, and carrier. Relationship managers all needed alignment. Touchscreen technology required new supply chains. Interface redesign required software architecture changes. That Symbian was not designed for. App Store models conflicted with carrier relationships, since carriers had been developing their own content distribution systems. Each department had valid concerns. Each delay was justified by real constraints. But the delays accumulated. By the time consensus emerged that fundamental response was necessary, the competitive environment had changed. Android appeared in 2008, providing an alternative smartphone platform that multiple manufacturers could adopt. This changed the strategic calculation. Nokia was no longer deciding whether to respond to Apple, but whether to respond to an entire ecosystem. Nokia recognized the threat. The company announced plans to transition from Symbian to a new platform. Multiple internal projects were initiated. Partnerships were explored. But organizational structure made rapid change difficult. The matrix organization that had ensured thorough decision-making now ensured slow decision-making. Each change required coordination across departments. That had been optimized for incremental improvement, not fundamental redesign. Software development timelines stretched. Projects that were supposed to take months took years. Each delay meant that by the time products launched, the competitive benchmark had moved forward. Manufacturing advantages became less relevant. Smartphone competition was increasingly about software, ecosystems, and developer support, not production efficiency. Nokia's core competency was no longer the primary competitive dimension. Carrier relationships weakened. As consumers became more aware of operating systems and app availability, they began requesting specific devices. Carriers responded to consumer demand rather than directing it. Nokia's distribution partnerships provided less advantage. Market share eroded steadily, not catastrophically, but consistently. Each quarter showed slight decline. Each decline was explainable: seasonal factors, regional variations, product transition timing. But the trend was directional. Internal reorganizations attempted to increase speed. The matrix structure was modified. Decision-making. Authority was centralized. But changing organizational structure does not immediately change organizational culture or accumulated expertise. The partnership with Microsoft in 2011 was an attempt to access a competitive software platform quickly, rather than developing one internally. This provided a short-term solution, but eliminated the possibility of independent, strategic direction. Decline accelerated after the Microsoft partnership. Symbian was deprecated, but Microsoft's platform did not gain market share quickly enough to replace lost Symbian volume. Nokia was caught between two systems. Abandoning one before the other was ready. By 2013, Nokia's market position had collapsed. The company that had held nearly half the global market now held less than 3% in smartphones. The mobile phone business was sold to Microsoft. Nokia, as a corporation, survived. The company had other divisions: network infrastructure, mapping services, patent portfolios. These were not dependent on mobile phone manufacturing. The network equipment business continued and eventually became Nokia's primary operation. The mapping services were sold. The patent portfolio generated licensing revenue. Nokia exists today as a different company, with the same name. What failed was not Nokia as a legal entity, but Nokia's mobile phone business model and the organizational system that operated it. The story reveals several things about organizational decision-making under disruption. First, that systems optimized for one environment can fail in another, even when the organization recognizes the change. Nokia knew smartphones were important. The company had been making smartphones before the iPhone existed. Recognition of threat did not translate to effective response. Second, that organizational structure determines response speed. Consensus-based decision-making works well for incremental improvement. It works poorly for rapid strategic shifts. Changing what an organization decides requires changing how it decides. Third, that core competencies can become liabilities. Nokia's manufacturing excellence was an advantage when hardware determined competition. It became irrelevant when software ecosystems determined competition. Existing strengths do not automatically transfer to new competitive dimensions. Fourth, that market position is not permanent moat. Nokia's distribution scale and carrier relationships were built over decades. They eroded in less than 5 years. Accumulated advantages are only advantages as long as they remain relevant. Fifth, that timing matters more than quality. Nokia's subsequent smartphones were not badly designed. They were late. In platform competition, being second with a better product is often worse than being first with an adequate one. The broader lesson is about the relationship between organizational structure and strategic flexibility. Organizations develop processes that encode past success. Those processes become institutional knowledge, best practices, and standard operating procedure. They make the organization efficient at doing what it already does well. But efficiency at existing operations creates rigidity around new operations. The same structures that ensure quality and consensus can prevent rapid response. There is no obvious solution to this trade-off. Organizations cannot be simultaneously optimized for stability and change. Nokia's system worked for over a decade. It failed in less than 6 years. Both the success and the failure emerged from the same organizational structure. The system did not change. The environment did.